Tout le monde, je pense que je vais commencer.
Welcome, everyone. We have the quorum, so we will begin. I would like to welcome Ms. Alsav.
We went through the House yesterday, so we welcome you as a member of the committee. And Mr. Godin will be here shortly, and Ms. Nassif. We welcome our guests, our witnesses from the IRB. Thank you for coming as we commence our study on the appointments and training processes and complaints processes around the IRB. It's a limited study. However, we are very glad you are here. Because of our late start, we'll kind of play it by. We're still going to end our meeting at 1 o'clock today. It's a busy day on the Hill today. And I will just test the pulse of the group at the end of the committee. My suspicion is you will want to have a full 2-hour meeting with the officials, so we will invite them to come back. But if the committee is satisfied with their question at the end, we may not need to do that. But just kind of giving our witnesses a heads up that you might be back. So thank you for coming. And we begin with a 10-minute statement. Thanks.
Thank you. My name is Paul Adderman. Since January of this year, I've been the acting chairperson of the Immigration and Refugee Board. Last year, the 4 divisions of the board, the Refugee Protection Division, or RPD, the Refugee Appeal Division, or RAD, the Immigration Division, and the Immigration Appeal Division made a total of 43,153 decisions. Those decisions were rendered by the IRB's 224 members. And those members, whether they're appointed by the Governor and Council in the case of the IAD or the RAD, or hired as public servants, as is the case for the RPD and the Immigration Division, are expected to behave professionally, fairly, and with integrity. I'd like to emphasize that their job is not an easy one. It is stressful. The pressure to produce fair decisions quickly is unrelenting for all 4 divisions. On the refugee side, that pressure is only growing. This year, we received 47,000 refugee claims. It's more than double what we received last year. Most of the decisions that these members take can have life-altering consequences for the people who are at the center of those cases. Members need to know the law inside out. They have to demonstrate sensitivity, empathy, stamina, and self-control. And I can tell you that the vast majority of the members of the board conduct themselves with the utmost professionalism. But that said, as part of a broader and ongoing effort to make the board more accountable, in 2017 we revised our member complaints procedure. Before I elaborate on the changes to that process, let me first address the board's recruitment, selection, training, and performance management programs. Il y a un rigoureux processus de sélection en place.
There is a rigorous selection process in place for commissioners. Candidates are first assessed based on their experience. Their abilities as arbitrators are evaluated via a written exam, an interview, verification of their references, and the validation of their security clearance. As an example, in the case of a competition for RPD commissioners held in 2015, 484 candidates applied, and only 51, in other words, 10% of them, qualified for an appointment. All new commissioners must follow in-depth training regarding the basic issues and effective communication with the parties involved before being able to sit. Some of the training could vary depending on the division, on the issues that will be dealt with. Other portions of the training are common to all divisions or sections. For example, commissioners receive sensitization training vis-a-vis, for example, the issues faced by the LGBTQ community. All new and experienced commissioners regularly attend workshops, professional training workshops, in order to keep abreast of the important and relevant issues and the updates in the federal court.
As members, in order to do their job, all members are required to take certain training that is mandatory for all board employees. For example, training on values and ethics and training on the creation of a respectful and harassment-free workplace. I'd like to now turn to the oversight of member conduct. The board has a detailed code of conduct. It applies to all members. In other words, all members need to adhere to the principles of good faith, fairness, accountability, dignity, respect, transparency, openness, discretion, cultural sensitivity, and loyalty to the organization. We monitor compliance with the code as part of a member's annual performance appraisal. So when we conduct performance appraisals, managers will often observe hearings, or they will conduct an ad hoc review of the audio recording of a hearing that a member's done. And they do this for, amongst other reasons, in order to assess how members treat the people who appear before them. They also read decisions issued by members. And again, one of the reasons that they do this is they want to ensure that the decisions are clear, that they're accessible, but that they're also respectful to the parties who presented their case. Managers also look at statistical indicators of performance, such as the number of cases finalized, how quickly they were done. In assessing the performance of members, the board has to respect their decision-making independence. In other words, nobody at the board will tell a member how to decide an individual case. That would be contrary to the law. It's important, at any point, if a person feels that a member has not respected the code of conduct in the way in which they've managed the case, that person can file a complaint under the board's complaints process. I'd like to stress here that the purpose of the code of conduct is to set standards for how a member conducts him or herself. The code and the complaints process are not there to deal with what the member decided. In other words, whether the decision was right or wrong in law. And the reason for that is that's a matter for the federal court to decide, not for the board. Now, stakeholders have criticized the complaints process. They've said that the process lacked transparency, it was too complicated, it didn't provide for enough oversight, and it was difficult to access. And the board agreed there was a need to improve the process. So in 2016, the previous chair, Mario Dion, now the ethics commissioner, decided to review our existing complaints mechanism. And in 2017, we consulted with stakeholders. We sought their input. Some of that input is reflected in a revised member complaints procedure that was developed to ensure a more centralized, simple, objective, and accessible process. So that process has been in place for 2 months now. It came into effect in December of 2017. What has changed? Well, first, the complaints process is centralized in the IRB's Office of Integrity, rather than dealing with complaints in each of the regional offices. The purpose behind that is to ensure greater consistency in how complaints are dealt with. Second, it's a much simpler process. The complaints go directly to the Director of Integrity. The Director of Integrity reports directly to the chairperson. So the management of complaints is no longer diffused and delegated to regional managers, and there are no longer multiple levels of review. Responsibility for complaints resides immediately with the chairperson. It's the chairperson who decides on all complaints. Third, the Office of Integrity, which is the investigative arm of the chairperson, is independent from the divisions. The Director of Integrity investigates the allegations in the complaint, prepares a report. It contains findings of fact, analysis, and suggested conclusions. The report goes directly to the chair. The chair decides whether or not to accept those conclusions and decides whether or not there was a breach of the code. Chair also has a discretion to have a qualified outside party investigate a complaint in exceptional circumstances. So fourth, this process is now much more accessible and transparent. Anybody, whether they're a participant in the hearing room or not, can file a complaint against a member where they believe there's been a breach of the code. And to that end, we've made the complaint form much more easy to access on our website. We've taken such measures as asking CBSA to post information in immigration detention centers and jails so that people who are detained under the Act also know what their rights are under the complaints process. Fifth, the process requires the chairperson to provide the member, the complainant, and the member's manager with detailed reasons as to why a complaint is founded or not. Sixth, the public reporting on the process will be more transparent. The Office of Integrity will post an annual report on the board's website. It will be sufficiently detailed to list all the complaints, their outcomes, in such a manner that a reader can look at the report and can understand what was the issue, what was the complaint about, and what did the board do about it, as opposed to simply saying whether it was founded or not founded. In order to protect privacy, the report will omit any information that could identify specific individuals. And as part of our regular monitoring and evaluation of our policies, we will undertake a review of the complaints process after a full year of its implementation. I'd like to emphasize it's not a review which will be conducted by the board. We will go outside the organization to hire a third party who has expertise in administrative law and how tribunals work in order to obtain that evaluation. I can indicate to you that the board would be happy to return here in 2019 to report on that. My view is that this new process will allow the board to deal more transparently and more effectively with complaints under the code. And thank you. I'd like to welcome your questions.
Thank you very much. You actually have 2 seconds left if you wanted it.
I'll pass. Thank you.
We begin the first round with Mr. Whalen for 7 minutes.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. With respect to the complaints process that was instituted in 2017, December 2017, what type of consultation and what was the process that you went through in order to develop the complaints procedure?
Well, I can turn to Greg Kipling to supplement what I'm going to tell you, but we have a standing stakeholder table which consists of the principal stakeholders of the board, so the Canadian Bar Association, Canadian Association of Refugee Lawyers, the Refugee Lawyers Association, which is in Toronto, ACADSI, which is the Quebec Immigration Bar, KPIC, which is the organization representing immigration consultants, CCR, the Canadian Council of Refugees. I believe Legal Aid Ontario may have been consulted with on this as well. And so whenever we do any policy, we go out to those stakeholders. We also, as far as I am aware, looked at other complaint systems in order to see how we would amend the process. Do you want to supplement?
Yeah, just to add that we received lots of feedback from our stakeholders, and they were very much engaged in the process and having the best possible complaints procedure that was possible. And we took on board many of their comments. Not all of them, but I would say most of them we were able to take on and integrate into the new procedure.
Is there anything particular that you said that you did not incorporate that the committee here should be aware of, something that was contentious, or that, because you said you didn't adopt all the recommendations, or anything in particular that we should be aware of?
They took the position that all the complaints needed to be dealt with by someone outside of the organization, an independent third party. And we have a director of integrity. The Office of Integrity has been in place since the beginning of 2016. That office deals with complaints to do with harassment. This is not necessarily specific to board members. It can be any employee. Values and ethics issues, conflict of interest issues. And the person who occupies that function, as I indicated, reports directly to the chair. That person is really at arm's length from the rest of the management team. In fact, the individual who occupies that position leads a somewhat lonely life because he's not invited to management meetings. He's not part of the regular management team. And the reason we do that is to keep him insulated from everyone else so that he's not co-opted. So he brings an independent perspective to these matters. In our view, that was an appropriate way to address the whole question of having someone at arm's length do it.
And in any event, the reports that come out of complaints are written reports that people can examine, although they're confidential as to the name of the people. it's open for scrutiny, so it's transparent in that respect, even if it's not 100% independent.
It's the reasons which are open to the parties, the complainant and the member and the member's manager. So what will actually happen when we're instituting this process is the chairperson will get a report. The investigation report will form the basis of the chair's decision, and then the chair will issue a set of reasons which says, allegation number 1, this is what was alleged, these are the findings that I'm making, this is or is not a breach of the code. Allegation number 2, and so on and so forth.
So, Mr. Adam, with respect to, this procedure was really instituted, what our studies really instituted about some fairly high-profile media complaints regarding actions and decisions and conduct of members of I guess it's the refugee protection
at that time, yes.
division at that time. How were those members at the time, or the people that were sitting? How were they appointed to the board? Did they go through the same selection, experience, examination, interview, security clearance process that is currently in place, or did they go through a different process?
Well, each government has changed the process slightly when it comes to the appointment of GICs. So in one instance, we were talking about somebody who was appointed as a governor and council appointee. In the other instance, it was somebody hired under the Public Service Employment Act, because the first 2 divisions, the initial divisions of the board, the Refugee Protection Division and the Immigration Division, those are public servants appointed under the Public Service Employment Act. So the GICs and the public, they're different regimes.
So that's one of the differences. So at least with respect to one of the individuals that the media reports were about, they were appointed under a different process than exists now. They were governor and council appointments, where now those are regular civil service job applications.
For the Refugee Protection Division. So in one instance where it involved a GIC, the process at the time was not much different from what we have now. There's some differences in terms of the composition of the selection panel, and the test has been beefed up. But by and large, the fundamentals are the same. It's, you apply, your application is screened on paper to see whether you meet the experience criteria. You're invited to write a test. If you pass the test, you'll be invited to an interview. And then they'll do the security screen.
With respect to the current complaints process, does it apply to complaints that existed prior to the process coming into force? So someone had a complaint,
no.
Formalized complaint. So what would be the process for complaints that related to decisions that were made prior to December 2017?
So typically what would happen is a complainant it would either be an individual or that individual's counsel writing to the board, raising a concern in writing. The matter would be referred to the member's immediate manager in the region. The manager would look into the complaint, conduct an investigation, make a determination, and if the person who complained didn't like that outcome, they would request a review by the deputy chairperson. If they didn't like the deputy chairperson's decision, they would request a review by the chairperson. It was a very layered process. It was diffuse in the sense that there was inconsistency between regions in the way in which the complaints were managed. And I think with the benefit of hindsight, it's an instance where the person who was doing the investigating was a little too close to the person who was being investigated.
I need to end you there, sorry. Thank you, Mr. Adderman. Mr. McGuire.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank you for your presentation, Mr. Adderman. Just a few questions. In regards to the IRB's website, it says that 4 complaints against the conduct of the IRB board members in, I think it's 16-17, remain unresolved at the end of that reporting period. So can you explain just what the nature of those complaints might be?
I wouldn't be able to tell you what the 4 unresolved ones are. Typically, if they're unresolved, it means that they were the process of investigating, they may have started late in the year and it carries over into the following year. In other words, they're not completed yet. That's usually what happens when they're not resolved. But sometimes the process can be long because here's why. If the complaint is laid in the middle of a hearing, typically what we will do, and this is true both of the old process and the new process, is we won't advise the member of that. So they won't be apprised of the fact that a complaint has been made against them until after they've concluded the case. And the reason that we do that is we don't want the adjudicative process to be distorted by someone trying to, put pressure on the member, by bringing a complaint forward. So it can go through the Refugee Protection Division, for example, and then it can go to the Refugee Appeal Division, and it's only when the board has completed its adjudicative tasks that we will then look at the complaint. There are some exceptions where we would actually, in the middle of the process, and we have done this, we would advise the member and we would take steps. It depends on the gravity of the complaint, but the large majority are ones where we would wait for the process to exhaust itself.
So at the end of 2016-17, pardon me, there were 4 outstanding, is that correct? And how many of those are still unresolved?
I believe 2. I'll have to check.
Yeah, I just wonder if you
we
could.
Can get.
Thanks. I'll move on. Just wonder if you could table, please, to the committee, a detailed overview of the anti-harassment as well as gender sexuality sensitivity training that new IRB members undergo.
Yes.
Can you detail that to us? Just provide us, just table that to the committee at some point?
Yes.
Okay. How are board members reprimanded if they, there's a complaint against them and it's found to be legitimate against them? How are they reprimanded?
It depends what the nature of the complaint is. We try to make the response sort of proportionate to the problem. So it can range from things like sitting down with the member and reminding them of their obligations under the code. That can also consist of, sort of doing that in writing with a formal reprimand. It can involve them being required to undergo training in specific areas. There are instances where we've removed a person from hearing cases until we've been satisfied that they're in a position to go back into the hearing room.
So you've got, I believe, 224 members, you said, or 2?
Correct.
Is this the correct number? And has anyone ever been removed from that position?
We've had instances where the person's employment has ended at the board, yeah.
Yeah. How many would that be? Does it happen very often?
It depends on the nature. It doesn't happen very often. It depends on the nature of the process. So more typically in the case of governor and council appointees, their term comes to an end and they're not recommended for reappointment. If it's someone under the Public Service Employment Act, it's a longer and more cumbersome process.
We may have, thank you, we've heard of, this may be a bit of a harsh word, but Kafkaesque oppression, that sort of thing. We've heard the IRB described as that, but it's not clear how the complaints are investigated, is what we've heard, and who conducts those investigations. Complainant is not informed of the disciplinary actions taken against members, and you just indicated perhaps that that doesn't happen, of course, in the middle of the process, but we're finding that they don't know those results at the end of the process either. So how often do you refer complaints to outside third-party people for investigation?
We have done it not particularly frequently. I can tell you off the top of my head, I can think of 4 instances, I think, in which we've done it. They've been ones where there's been very serious misconduct, bordering, well, not bordering on, in some instances, criminal behavior. But in other instances, I mean, we have one instance a few years ago where it was just a very heated dispute between the member and a council, and in that instance, it's actually Mario Dion who was hired to conduct an investigation into that particular complaint, and he concluded that there was no breach of the code.
One of the concerns raised is that the IRB appointees don't have any legal background. Would you support updating the requirements and ensure that at least some formal legal education is required?
Ultimately, sort of the hiring choices and the criteria when it comes to governor and council appointees are a matter right now for the Privy Council office because they control that process. But let me just speak to that generally, because the board's an administrative tribunal, and we're supposed to be accessible, and we're supposed to be non-legalistic, and we're supposed to be informal. And we have we have a number of members who are not lawyers, and in my view, it's actually a good thing. So the proportion of lawyers is fairly high. I don't have it precisely, but I would say it's in the order of around 75%. 79% actually have a legal degree. But in my experience, you know, you can have a law degree and not be very good as a decision maker. You know, I think the learning curve is long.
I guess where I'm going is, and there are some though. I mean, there's still
Yes.
21% someplace. Do they have any legal background? I mean, I'm not saying they have to be a lawyer. I mean, just the outline of the legal system that they may need to go through in the course of the interviews with the claimants, and so, you know, how many of these current IRB decision makers do not have any legal experience? Then is it the full other 21%?
I need you to answer very quickly.
I can't tell you exactly, because there may be some of those who have no formal legal training, but they have experience as adjudicators in other administrative tribunals. So
Thank you. Sorry, I have to end you there. It's going to have 7.5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, and thank you to the officials. The interim third-party report is said to be a comprehensive report, and therefore I assume that the report would have addressed issues of training, appointments, and complaints. And I wonder if you could table a copy of that report for this committee.
I'm sorry, a copy of?
Of the third-party review report by Neil Yates.
Well, this is a report, it's advice to the minister. It's been shared with the board. To be perfectly frank, I'm not sure whether it's the board's to table.
Well, I know, but we're at this committee and we're studying the issue around appointments, we're studying the issue around complaints, around training. And so if that report actually touched on those issues, I think it'd be very informative for this committee to take a look at that report to see what work has been done.
I would give you leave to consult with your lawyers and do that. So there's been a request for a report made, and you'll have to consult to decide whether or not you'll respond, whether it's appropriate for you to respond.
Okay, and all right, on the appointments, according to the information provided to us, there are some 26 vacancies through the for the appointments. So has the IRB made requests for the government to fill the outstanding orders in council appointments? For example, in Calgary, there's been a vacancy for 2,929 days. In Toronto, there's a vacancy for 534 days. So has that request been made to the government to fill these appointments?
Well, we certainly make our needs known to the government, yes.
Okay. And what amount of resources would be required to train them if these appointments were filled? And how long until they could begin hearing cases? And on average, how many extra cases per year would these 26 new appointments be able to hear? And what kind of resources in total amount would be required for the appointment, for the training and resourcing of these appointments? If you don't have that information, you can table it with the committee.
Yeah, we would have to get back to you on some aspects of those questions. Being able to sort of segregate, the institutional costs around training, I wouldn't know what that is off the top of my head. I can see whether we can get it. Disaggregating it is not that simple. I can tell you, Getting up to speed, it takes a minimum of 6 months from the time of appointment, and even then, the period from 6 to 12 months, members are not working at optimal output. We really expect them to be sort of fully productive after 12 months.
Okay.
How many cases that translates into, it's a function really of which division they're assigned to. For example, a member of the IAD, fully productive, is expected to complete in the order of 150 appeals a year.
Okay, great. If you can give us some projections then in the different areas
Yes.
of that would be appreciated. How many members with valid complaints on their record have been reappointed?
I would have to get back to you
Okay.
on that. I don't know.
That's fine. I know these are
Some of
detailed
that,
questions. Yeah.
it's a question of how far back do we go. You're
Well,
talking about current sitting members?
current sitting members.
Okay.
Correct. And so, in terms of complaints, how many complaints against board members are submitted annually? And does the IRB track how many complaints are made by board members? And can we also get a list of the breakdown of those sanctions for these individuals whose complaints were found to be valid?
Yeah, so the numbers fluctuate fairly considerably. We have numbers going back to 2009. If you average it out, it's about 18 a year.
So maybe I can stop you from then. Can you give us a list breaking it down by the year of how many complaints annually, and then and to provide that information to the
Yeah.
to the committee? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. And
some of the record keeping, it, when you go further back, is not terribly accurate. But
we'll start with 2009 and go from there.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. And are there any processes in place to ensure that a lawyer does not appear before a board member they currently have a complaint in the system?
No.
There is no. Okay.
No, and I can tell you why not. Because we have to. The complaints process has to be reconciled with the integrity of the adjudicative process. And what we don't want to do is turn the complaints process into a vehicle for shopping for members that a particular council might like to appear before, and to avoid members that they don't want to appear in front of.
Can you provide for the committee the information on, does the IRB know how often does this happen, where a person has an active complaint with a member, and that they actually have a current case with? Do you track that information, and can you provide that information to the committee?
I can tell you what typically what happens is, when a complaint is made, very frequently what happens is the council makes a complaint, and at the same time they make a bias motion in front of the member. So in the hearing room, because they're under an obligation to do that if they're alleging.
No, I understand that process, but I'm just wondering whether or not the IRB tracks this information, and can you provide it to the committee?
I don't know that we track it, because we will know about any individual case where a particular council has raised a concern about a member, but then we would have to look at all the other cases that council has to see whether that member is sat on those.
Okay, so you don't have that information. No. All right. Does the IRB keep stats then on the nature of the complaints in categories? And if you do, can you provide that information to the committee?
We don't keep stats on the nature. We don't break them down. We would have to go through them individually to give you a sense of what they are.
Will you be able to do that?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And earlier there was a question about the consultation. Can you provide a full list of who was consulted for the review process? And can you also provide the committee with a list of the recommendations that were not implemented? You highlight one specific one, which is around the independence issue. I would argue, of course, on the independence issue, while you have the Office of the Integrity, somewhat independent, but all of those decisions gets put forward to the chair, who is not independent. And why not go all the way and make sure that every single decision sits with a independent authority with respect to complaints, so that you have full transparency?
I'm afraid I need to end you there. You'll get another chance. Mr. Nansangari, for 7 minutes. We're going to go back to our 7 minutes. Each of the parties had 7.5 minutes on the first round.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I think as this is our first meeting back, I think Chair and all of our colleagues will accept that Salma Zahid is taking a leave, and all of our thoughts and prayers are with her in a very most difficult time for her and her family. I do want to first thank both of you for being here. I know the IRB has been the subject of a number of developments recently, and I want to just start specifically with the appointments process. I know that's something that's been revamped, but how many appointees do you have that predates 2015, the current process you've put in?
I don't have a specific number. I can tell you there've been, I believe, 89 appointments made under this government.
So are you confident that all the appointees, including the current appointees right now, are competent to serve in the role of IRB adjudicator, and depending on the division, do you feel that they're competent and they meet the standards that you as chair would expect of your colleagues? You are. I have heard from council in a number of different cases where they would go in and say if a particular applicant is from a particular country, then there's a track record of an IRB adjudicator consistently turning down those applications. Do you have any tracking, any sense of that type of trends? Do you track those trends? And secondly, have any of those complaints come to you? Because I know they have been the subject of some federal court interventions.
Yeah, well, we don't track those trends because we don't want to interfere with the independence of the individual decision makers, and the recourse there is properly with the federal court. So, members will adjudicate differently. They based on their appreciation of the facts and the law, and that may lead to different results. But I think by and large, what drives those outcomes is more the country conditions than the proclivities of individual members.
I can appreciate that, but certainly, I do think that many of the lawyers have commented on perhaps biases of individual adjudicators, right? So in that circumstance, would there not be a need for a basic standard of understanding on country conditions? Because IRB does, you do packets of country conditions,
right?
And I think they should be, I'm sure they're consistent across the board. And if there's a particular viewpoint there and that's not reflected in the decision making, then would that not be a cause for concern for you?
Well, in an ideal world, we would have 100% consistency, but it's a process which is actually adjudicated by humans, and any adjudicative system, the boards or any other one, will have variances in decision making. The check on that, though, is not the complaints process, I would argue. I think the check on that is the process of judicial review, and seeing whether or not the decision is sustainable.
But if I may just clarify, process of judicial review is really up to the federal court to grant leave or not, right?
Yes.
So it's not an automatic right to an appeal, right? It's more of a
absolutely, and it's absolutely fair comment to say that there are a number of other variables that come into play, like can you afford to go to federal court? If you can afford to go to federal court, do you get leave? But the one thing which we have in place right now is we have the RAD, and the RAD doesn't cost anything. So you get an appeal as of right to the RAD with certain exceptions, and that's an appeal within the board. The RAD is there, at least on the refugee side, to look at what the RPD did and decide whether or not they agree with it or not. So that that feature is baked into the process.
Right. And coming back to two individual cases, and I don't know if you're in a position to comment on them, but Sterling and Cassano, I believe they're adjudicators, and they've been the subject of a number of reports. Are you able to advise us as to why action wasn't taken earlier? Are you able to disclose that information here?
Well, I feel a little bit uncomfortable talking about the appraisal process that took place in the past for a couple reasons. Some of it involves personal information. The other one is I can't get into the mind of the people who made those decisions.
So maybe in general terms, do you believe that in the last 2 years, your process of complaints met the standard that you as a chair would want to have across the board in the IRB?
I would say no, and that's why we revamped it. I think what we have is a much stronger process now because the chair is ultimately accountable for the reputation of the organization. The chair is ultimately the person who has the responsibility of ensuring that the integrity of the decision-making process is respected, but that the integrity of the board's reputation is also respected. So, the buck stops there. It's, I think with the benefit of hindsight, the process in the past was multi-layered and a bit bureaucratic.
Yeah. Thank you. And I do want to take a moment just to thank Mr. Kipling, who was here last time and was very helpful in providing some information to us. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Mr. Tilson for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I just want to echo the comments made by Gary on Selma, and we, on this side, obviously wish her well and a speedy recovery as well. Mr. Chairman, on my questions, one of the reasons why this study has taken place, at least for some of us, is this media piece that came out by Global News by Messrs. Hill and Russell with the heading, "Lawyers Allege Sexist Aggressive Behavior by Powerful Immigration Refugee Judges." I'm sure the board had a fit when it saw this. But could you comment on this? Because it's not very, the whole issue we're talking about is building confidence in the board, just like that, the public wants to have confidence in the judicial process and making sure the Judicial Council makes decisions, which they have done, and the Law Society makes decisions. So can you comment on this piece? Because it's very devastating towards the decisions that have been made. And these aren't decisions on the merits of the case. These are comments that have been made about the conduct of hearing officers. And if this piece is right, they were all dismissed, maybe for good cause.
So, yes, first of all, it was, as you've indicated, it wasn't something that the board was pleased to read about at all. The reputation of other decision makers gets dragged down by, a single instance like that. I think the one thing which I can tell you, and this is, with the benefit of hindsight, there's an area which I think the new process will have corrected, and it's this. Typically what happens, we don't have difficulty dealing with instances where there's a blatant and obvious disrespectful comment. Those are the easy cases to deal with. The difficult ones are ones where the member is in the hearing room and they feel that they have to pursue a line of questioning which is very personal and delves into the personal details of a claimant. And that's what happens when we deal with cases involving things like sexual orientation or domestic violence. And, the member, the counsel will say, this is a disrespectful and inappropriate line of questioning. The member's perspective on that is, I have to do my job, I'm asking some tough questions. And there's an overlap there.
Questions in this were really inappropriate. I assume there's a transcript made of these hearings, and that you or someone would have had an opportunity to look at the transcript, and I'm sure you would agree, I don't want to read them because they're inappropriate, and I'm sure you found them inappropriate.
Absolutely.
And what happened? What happened to this hearing officer? How was he reprimanded for these comments that he made to this person?
He was, in that instance, he was given specific training on the board's gender guidelines after the complaint.
Yeah, that's what the article said. You think that? I guess that Then I return to the piece that's in here where you've mentioned it in your opening remarks about the integrity person. Is that a person or is that a group of people?
It's a person.
It's a person.
Yeah,
And
he has some support.
So that person investigates allegations such as were made in this piece, and then the integrity person reports to the chair.
Under the new process.
And the chair makes the decision.
Correct. Under the new process. So that's been in place in the last 2 months. So the cases in which you're referring to were dealt with under the old process.
I understand that.
Yeah.
The serious cases, of course, and you're a member of the Ontario Bar. The Ontario Bar hears all kinds of complaints from people against their lawyers for they charge too much or something. Many of them are frivolous cases. But the serious ones come to light, and the public hears about those things.
Yeah.
I don't think that we're hearing about those serious cases in the board.
I think that's a valid criticism, which is why what we're doing under the new process is publicizing the reasons for decision where a determination is that the code was breached or that it wasn't breached.
I read some of these things, and they're like 4 lines. They don't say much.
Right.
Well, are you going to improve on that?
Yes.
How are you going to improve on that?
By providing detailed reasons which set out what is the allegation and what determinations were made as to whether or not the complaint was founded or not.
I'm afraid I need to end off that one. Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Tabara.
And I want to continue kind of the line of questioning that my colleague, Mr. Enna Sangria, was talking about. Can you tell us what kind of training the programs currently exist for training board members on cultural sensitivity, gender identity? Because you said the process now, when you were answering the question from my colleague, is much stronger now. It's been revamped. Can you tell us what that process is? What has been revamped?
What's been changed is the complaints process. And the complaints process has been changed in the following ways. The chairperson has direct accountability for the complaints now through the Director of Integrity. So anyone who makes a complaint today, it goes to the Director of Integrity, and the Director of Integrity advises the chairperson right away. The Director of Integrity is the one who investigates the complaint. No longer do we have the complaints investigated by regional managers, so it's the person in the chairperson's office who does the investigation. The chairperson is the one who ultimately makes a determination as to whether any complaint is founded or not, so we don't any longer have multiple levels of review in the process, which should make it faster. It'll be a more transparent accounting on those because up to now, what we've done in the past is to provide on the board's website very cursory description of the number of complaints made and whether they were founded or not, but no explanation of what the nature of the complaint was and the reasoning behind the board's determination as to whether it was founded or not. So now we will produce the reasons. They'll be anonymized because we need to protect the privacy of all of the individuals involved. But any reader will be able to look at that and say, the board received a complaint on this date, this is what it was about, this is how it was adjudicated, this is how it was decided.
So how is that different than from the previous system? If you had multiple levels of review, that sounds like it's a good thing, no? Or
I think with the benefit of hindsight, not necessarily, because essentially what would happen is one decision would just confirm the other one, and the more decisions that were there, the less reluctance of the organization to sort of examine those and take a harder look at them. I think if it goes directly to the chairperson's accountable to the public, to Parliament, and the chairperson, the buck stops there. I think that's a significant difference.
And my next question is in terms of decision makers. I've been reading this article that I have here, and there are certain decision makers who have 54% of all claims having no credible basis.
Yeah.
And then you have other decision makers that have 28.6% no credible basis.
Yeah.
Is there an oversight body that looks at maybe these cases and just, takes a certain percentage of the decision makers' cases to see if they're in line, or does this go on for, many years, and maybe they need to look at, there's other training to see if that they decision makers have kind of close percentage?
Well, as indicated before, the vehicle for providing a check on that is the federal court. The question of whether there's no credible basis to a claim is a legal and factual question. And the integrity of the decision-making process can be undermined if the board is saying, to individual decision makers, oh, you're deciding yes too much or you're deciding no too much, because then there's a hidden pressure on them which undermines their decision-making independence. That's something which the federal court is there for. There's aspects of a board member's behavior which have nothing to do with their independence, where we need to sort of be more accountable. So, adjudicative independence is not a license to be disrespectful in the hearing room. It's not a license to make insensitive comments. And those are the kinds of things where I think the organization can do better in terms of the complaints process.
I'm afraid I need to end you there. I was checking out the parties' thoughts about the next meeting, and there has been indication from the parties that we will end up liking more time with you. So I just wanted to let you know you don't need to rush your questionings today. We'll get another bit more time after the 2-week break we have. So Mr. Tilson, for 5 minutes.
Yes. The 2018-2019 interim estimates flag about $119 million for the IRB. Could you elaborate on the uses in which this funding will be put?
Just want to caution the member to make sure we stay within the scope of the study.
Well, I don't know, sir. I mean, that's why I'm asking the question, whether these monies are being spent on, we've talked about training, we've talked about a whole slew of things. And
I'll allow it just to, we're trying to. Okay.
We'll let them answer.
Sure.
Give them a chance, Mr. Chairman.
Good.
Do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Yes. So in 2017-18, we have the budget of the IRB is divided among different program areas. So the program areas focus on the decision-making function of the board, and then there's a portion allocated to internal services. So
I don't know what that means.
So I'll try to explain.
Okay.
So the total budget allocated to the IRB in 2017-18 was about $135 million. Of that money, all but $38 million went to support the decision-making function. So the refugee determination process, the refugee appeal determination process, the immigration division, and the immigration appeal division. $38 million of that was for internal services, which would include all manners of support to the decision-making function. So including training, legal support, communications, etc. So in relation to the training, which I know is of interest to the committee, would come from that budget. And we have a unit within the IRB that is responsible for learning and professional development, which is not 100% allocated to just to support the decision maker training, but a lot of that unit's work is focused on decision-making or training, along with our legal services unit.
About a year ago, there was a report in the National Post about a wide discrepancy in the rates of release by various board members conducting detention hearings. And it was stated that there was no complaints process to address these variances. I'd like you to comment as to whether or not you agree with that or don't agree with that. And if so, has this been addressed? And is this a result of training, or are there other factors involved?
So the complaints process, the complaints process about member conduct applies to all members of the board. So it applies to the members of the Immigration Division who conduct detention reviews. The question, I think, which you're putting is about variances, I believe, between regions in release rates. So there are discrepancies in decision making there. There are a number of factors that go into that. Partly it's the decision making, the decisions made by individual members, and but it's also a function of the way the cases are presented to them in the region. So it's a function of the extent to which CBSA opposes or agrees to release. That has an impact on it as well. I can advise you, one of the concerns that the previous chair had was about the approach to long-term detention, because the board was...
Well, I guess my question, sir, is that the fact there's discrepancies, and if there are discrepancies, and again it gets back to the issue of my earlier question of confidence in the board, and we need to have confidence, and if there's wide discrepancies, there won't be confidence. And so my question to you is, and I think you've agreed on that, so therefore my question is, how is this being rectified?
Well, it needs to be addressed through training, and training which goes across in each region where that particular division is operating, so that we narrow those down. So that's an ongoing process, but it comes back to an issue which has been raised before. There's a problem if the board directs outcomes to individual decision makers. The integrity.
Oh, I concur with that. I guess my question is, you want to make sure that the decisions that are being made in Quebec are the same as decisions that are being made in Alberta, without referring to those cases. I mean,
I'm afraid
there's discrepancies.
I need to cut you off,
Okay.
Mr. Former Chair. Thank you. Good questioning. Could I just ask one question, and that is with respect to the complaints process. Am I right? I might have missed this. Right in understanding that only direct actors can do a complaint.
No.
A third party, can a third party do a complaint?
Anyone can bring a complaint.
So you could do a class complaint comparing judgments. That would be a complaint, or is it only a complaint about an individual case?
No, the complaints they're not. I think this goes back to a critical point, which I'd just like to underscore. The code is about how members conduct themselves, their behavior in the hearing room. It's not about the merits of individual decisions. So concerns about inconsistencies in outcomes is properly a matter which is either addressed through the judicial review process, as well internally through processes like training members on issues. So, discussion between members about inconsistencies is actually the most effective way to reduce those inconsistencies.
Okay,
but
thank
that's
you.
not the same as malfeasance or bad behavior in the hearing room, or treating someone without sufficient respect.
Okay, thank you. That's clear. Ms. Ellslev.
Thank you very much. I'd like to leverage a little bit more on that conversation because particularly around decisions, I recognize that you're talking about the independence of the decision maker, but at the same time, earlier on in the conversation, you talked about how managers will review those transcripts. to be able to address personnel evaluation reviews on an annual basis? Is there a mechanism, not necessarily even around personnel evaluation reviews, but to audit and get a feel for whether those decisions are with bias or within a certain scope of framework as an independent oversight, or not independent, but a second set of eyes, so that the only mechanism of reflecting on inconsistencies between decisions is not the review board, the judicial review board? Right.
So there are other means to get at some of those issues. There's the individual performance appraisal, and it might be helpful for the committee to actually see what those forms look like, to see what's being, what are we evaluating there? And it's important there, when I do an evaluation of a member, I'm looking at how they do their job. I'm not telling them, oh no, you shouldn't have said yes here and you should have said no there. I'm looking at whether they're respectful, whether they make the process accessible to people. I'm looking at whether they're efficient. I'm looking at how they participate in things like professional development. But I'm not saying to them, oh no, you were wrong when you said yes to this person, or you were wrong when you said, no to that person. So there's that. There are instances, and we have an instance going on at the moment, where on a systemic level there's a concern. And so, for example, the Immigration Division, we were criticized very heavily in a few judgments, both in the federal court and in Superior Court, on our treatment of long-term detention. And in that instance, the former chair, decided to do an audit of how we're doing long-term detention decisions. It's being done by a third party, someone external to the organization. It's an extraordinary measure. We've never done that before, but it's a tool that's also available to the organization.
So in light of that, then, would you consider it not being only an extraordinary, but considering it as a more regular, random audit to ensure the integrity of the decision-making process?
There's one other piece which I should mention to you, which we do on a cyclical basis, which is we have someone from outside the board conduct a scan of how a division does its work. It's a sort of quality measurement initiative. So, for example, and we could share this with the committee, we did one recently on the Refugee Appeal Division where we had an external party come in and look at how the process is being run. There are a number of variables that were being assessed there. Do you want to elaborate on those?
Sure. Yeah. So it's a initiative that's been in place for several years now, and as Mr. Adamman indicated, we do it cyclically on each of the divisions of the IRB, looking at essentially breaking down the process into three parts: pre-proceeding, the proceeding itself, and then post-proceeding, to examine whether the decision was well rendered in the sense that it was easy to understand, were the files well prepared in advance of the hearing, et cetera, et cetera. So it's looking at systemic issues. It's not looking at individual performance, but it is, in a number of cases, it's identified specific areas where we can improve. And we've acted in several cases on different issues that have been identified.
And then is there a feedback loop into the appointment process? So as you become more aware of challenges or whatever, you feed that back into the appointment process so that and the training process?
Well, I'll give you a specific example. If you look at the report that was prepared on the Refugee Appeal Division, there were comments in there from an external third party saying, these reasons are, too long and complicated. They're difficult to understand. That was one of the criticisms. So, our training subsequent to that has been focusing on simplifying the way the reasons are written. Perfect. That's a concrete example of where that feedback loop actually operates. And that's not going on an individual level. This is on a systemic level. So individual decision makers are having their performance assessed, but we do look at how the system works too.
Perfect. And then if I could go...
I'm afraid I need to end you there. Sorry. Ms. Kwan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Just to follow up on the question that Mr. Tilson asked with respect to the breakdown of the budget. I wonder if you could table that information for the committee so we can carefully look at that. In terms of the audit that you just referenced, Mr. Adamant, I think it was Mr. Adamant, was that Kipling? Yeah. Could we have a copy of that audit? Can we take a look at it?
It's not complete yet.
It's not complete. And when do you anticipate that it'll be completed?
It'll be completed, I think, in June.
In June.
And I can advise you that it'll be made public.
Okay, great.
There's an obvious concern there, and the organization has to respond to it.
So just to get back to the issue around the complaint process, so when a member is found to have a valid complaint against him or her, is there a follow-up process after the sanctions have been levied? So in the case of Mr. Sterling, it sounded like he was made to go through some training. What steps is taken after that training to ensure that, in fact, the training has been effective?
Well, the annual performance appraisal is the vehicle whereby that is, that is assessed, because essentially that person's manager would have been aware of what training they had to undergo, and that person's manager would have been on the lookout for whether or not that training was effective.
So that's done through an annual review at the end of...
Yeah.
Okay. Now, on the judicial review issue, now I know that in the complaint process or within the IRB, you want to ensure that the members operate independently, and I'm not questioning that. And you mentioned that the process in which people can go through if they felt that a decision has been wronged in for whatever reason. But if a decision is found to have been based on no credibility basis, the courts cannot overturn that because they do not look at that question. And so now I just want to table that because that's just a statement of fact. So I want to then ask a series of these questions because I think these things are interlinked. Did I hear correctly that the IRB does not keep statistics on the acceptance rate for each board member?
That information is available to us, but we don't track it. I mean, we don't. No, we don't look at member X and say that they have an 80% acceptance rate and member Y has a 40% acceptance rate. We don't do that.
But that information is available to you.
It's available. It's available because it exists in the database. But just because the information exists doesn't mean that we track it. It would be inappropriate for us to do that.
Do you take a look at the information, or do you look at the information on the basis of those decisions that are rejected and then go to federal court and is overturned by the federal court? Do you track that information?
Well, we certainly use the return rate from the federal court as an indicator of whether or not there should be some concern about a member's performance. It's not so, and it's an important distinction because we will look at the member's performance. I'll take information from any source, but I will make an independent determination as to whether the member is performing or not. So they may have their case overturned by the federal court, and it may be because they dealt with a novel point of law and there was nothing wrong with their decision. Or they may have gotten hammered by the federal court. And if they got hammered by the federal court, I'll read those reasons, and I may have my concerns about those. The integrity of the process depends upon the individual manager making their own determination about whether the member is performing appropriately or not.
Well, I think this is tied in terms of information that would be useful with respect to the appointments and so on. If, for example, you have a consistent member whose cases consistently, they find that the claimant's application is rejected, right? They refuse that application. It goes to federal court and it consistently gets overturned, or a substantive number of those gets overturned, then I think that there is some relevancy. Yeah. And then if you couple that with the individual who may well have a series of complaints against them for misconduct, right? and then those misconducts are found to be valid, then there's correlation between these numbers. So it would be very useful for us as we study this, do this study, to have that information, to get a sense of it in terms of what that looks like. Can you provide that information to us?
Well, first of all, I'd agree with you. You know, if a member keeps making the same mistake and doesn't get the message, and the court is telling them that, then yes, there's a problem, and that needs to be addressed. So, you know, but there's a question of looking at, you know, why was the member overturned in any given instance? If there's a pattern there, then that's something which is obviously of concern. So I'm not sure what information you would want from the board in that regard.
Well,
I'm going to, we're way over time on your slot, but if I just give you time to finish that. Just before you do, I'm going to suggest to the committee that we've come to the end of that full round, and as opposed to starting with Liberals for 7 minutes and then cutting off the Conservatives, I'm going to suggest we end after Ms. Kwan and begin a fresh round at the beginning of the next meeting and have a full hour at that time. That's okay with everybody? And we have guests coming from France, from the French Parliament, and those of you that can stay, we can stay. So I'll just get, we're way over, but just let you finish that thought. Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for allowing me to do that. So the information that I'm looking for would be the, excuse me, the acceptance rate or the rejection rates of each of the members, and then the federal court decisions on those rejected cases that have been accepted by the federal court, and then also a list of numbers associated with the complaints made against that member. Because that, and how many of those complaints are in fact valid complaints. That will give us a full picture of these appointments and the lay of the land on how things are going.
Okay, thank you very much. So our proposal will be just a reminder that we will have the minister come for Sup C, Supplementary Estimate C, on Monday. You'll be getting a notice the 19th of March, and we'll be extending an invitation to our witnesses to come back on Tuesday, the 20th, for an hour, and we'll do no more statement, but we'll have a full round of questioning then, and then we'll have our other witnesses come in the second hour, and the next day we'll probably need another half meeting just to give you a heads up, because we have witnesses that have already been started to be looked at, so we have a full roster of witnesses as well. So we'll see you. Those of you can stay for our delegation from the French Parliament. It's great to have you stay, and thank you for our witnesses. Now you know what to look forward to in a couple of weeks. This meeting's adjourned.